Welcome to episode 118, Supporting African American Clients, Increasing Access to Care and Appreciating Cultural Norms, featuring Dr. Tammy Hodo. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future podcast episodes. By Clearly Clinical, learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I'm excited today to be joined by Dr. Tammy Hodo. She has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in Urban Studies and a minor in sociology with a specialization in race, class, gender, and ethnicity. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Hodo.
Thank you so much, Beth, for having me.
So why don't you take a moment and tell us more about yourself and about your background, and then we will dive into this topic of discussing improving access to mental health care in the African American community.
Well, I'm originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is the third most segregated metropolitan statistical area in America. My parents married in 1962, which is not right, nothing unique except for my parents don't match. So my father was African American. He's passed away, but my mother is German and Welsh, but American. So they married before Loving versus Virginia. And we grew up in a predominantly white space in Milwaukee because of the segregation. So I have my doctorate from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, as you indicated, and I focus on race, class, gender, and ethnicity because as a biracial person, I find that I continue to struggle with the whole social construct of race, knowing that really, we're all just human beings. That we all have different ethnicities, but race is a social construct, so it's not even biologically real, but it's something that we as a society has created. We've created and we've given it power. And it causes so many problems like access to mental health, educational inequality, and just a variety of issues. But I'm also a TEDx speaker. So I did my TEDx on the social implications of race, where I traced the US Census from 1790 until now in regards to the way they counted and categorized people. And initially, they only had three options. Either you were Black, a slave, mulatto, or you were a free white. I find it interesting that a lot of European or Caucasian Americans now don't realize that the Irish, Polish, and Italian were not considered white when they initially came to America. And I've seen, them being absorbed into this whole construct of whiteness. And I've seen those who historically have been oppressed now become the oppressor. So that's problematic in itself. But I also see issues in the African American community when I think of homophobia, which is, an issue, very serious issue in the Black and Brown community. And again, there we get the oppressed becoming the oppressor. So I'm just really excited to be here and just talk about, the lack of access and about being culturally competent surrounding providing services to African Americans and their families.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us, Tammy. And you are also the founder and president of All Things Diverse. Can you take a quick moment and just tell our listeners what that is and the work that you do on the day-to-day?
Sure. So All Things Diverse is an educational consulting firm. I was in academia as a faculty member or an administrator, it would depend. But I left there and basically established my own educational firm focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, working with companies, universities, not-for-profits, different agencies regarding becoming culturally competent, diversity within organizations, and employees are actively engaged in wanting that diverse workplace as well as that inclusivity that should be included in that.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today and sharing some of your experience and your expertise on this topic. So today we're going to be talking about the issue of mental health care access in the African American community. Tammy, where would you like to start on this topic?
Well, I would just like to say, basically, I want to start with the cultural competency component. Reality is so like when I do studies and I've seen, so we'll speak from a sociological perspective for me. So in sociology, we recognize that when the African American family has been studied in the past, it's traditionally been studied with the European American group being seen as the default race that all others are compared to. And that is so problematic because reality is the experiences have been polar opposite. So in sociology, we've seen this social pathological approach being used to study the African American family. And again, they would compare a two-parent nuclear European American household to a single female headed household, African American household. And then they would say, oh, well, see, look at all these things that are wrong, and just not recognizing the differences and the different experiences and how that impacts the family. And then we've had another approach in sociology, which is the strength based approach to studying the African American family, which is one that has traditionally been used by sociologists of color. And it basically says, yes, the African American family is different, but after slavery, Jim Crow, eugenics, and all these other things, all these different types of institutional as well as informal oppression, here we still stand. So that's kind of that strength-based approach, but it both approaches are problematic because one is comparing it to white families, which again, the experiences are different. And the strength approach is problematic because it doesn't take into consideration some of the institutional and contemporary policies that we continue to see and experience and struggle with.
Well, you just said there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack. Where do you think we should start in this conversation? I mean, one of the things that occurred to me while you were talking, what jumps out is just these continuing generational traumas. And then a group of people that, as you and I have talked privately, a group of people that have been institutionally discriminated against and with norms created in society to make sure that it stays that way, whether that's voting rights, housing rights, things like that. Where do you think we should go?
Well, I think that generational trauma is real. And I think that your audience understands that. And to understand, like African American history doesn't begin with slavery, but too often that's how it's depicted. The people who were stolen, sold, or whatever from the west coast of the continent of Africa, they were not slaves. They were future, engineers, doctors, lawyers, school teachers, whatever. But when they were brought to America, they were indeed enslaved. And the whole point of that was that they didn't speak the language. I mean, where were they going to go to? Families were sold, and separated at the discretion of the owner of that family. I mean, and if you don't believe that trauma has continued, throughout these generations and just seeing how these families have been broken up and that disconnect. One of the mechanisms that slaves would do is that they wouldn't try to name their child, the first name would be the last name that they had. And that way, when they got separated, because they knew it was inevitable, they would be able to locate their child ideally. So, I mean, if we just think about the history of America, so we have over 200 years of slavery. Then we had failure in Reconstruction, right? When Reconstruction was happening and we had the troops in the South, African Americans were doing okay. Reality is that upon emancipation, African Americans were getting educated at a higher rate than lower income white families because there were no schools in the South. But African Americans the free ones began to establish. European Americans, white families would send their children to school in the Northeast. That's why we see all those old universities there. But I mean, and then we see Reconstruction, and once the troops were removed, Jim Crow set in, and so we see that, and we see, I mean, I can turn on the television and be re-traumatized at any time if I watch an old movie where, the dogs are being released and hoses are being released and people are being beat just for being asked to be treated as humans, like James Baldwin, I think it is, that, had the thing, I am a man, and just realizing that our experiences have been rather different. And a lot of it has been legal and institutionalized. And this trauma just continues. I mean, so we go from Jim Crow to mass incarceration. which is disproportionately also affected African Americans. It's real easy to say it's something wrong with those people, recognizing that 1 out of 3 African American men will be under the control of the criminal justice system at some point in their life. But reality is that no, it's nothing wrong with these people except for they're being over policed in certain communities, which tend to be low income. And there's this direct correlation between race, although a social construct, and social economic status because of these historical and some of the contemporary policies and practices that are in play. So, yes, this trauma just continues generationally from lack of access, lack of equity, lack of equality. And it just continues. And it's like the snowball effect. And it's just getting bigger. We see with the Black Lives Matter movement, we see conversations surrounding that trauma within African American communities and recognizing America is highly segregated based on social class. And again, that correlation between race and social class.
As you're talking about this, of course, so you and I are recording this right now in February of 2021, and even when we look at the people that have in the United States that have gotten coronavirus, that have passed away due to coronavirus complications, and just another example of the inequity in the fact that Black and brown individuals are significantly more likely to get coronavirus, also more likely to die from it. And at least as we stand right now, with vaccines rolling out, significantly less likely to be able to actually get a vaccine relative to their white counterparts. So all of these things kind of bring us to our conversation right now and talking about kind of mental health access. Tell me kind of some norms within the African American community that our listeners need to keep in mind, just even considering what mental health means in the African American community and norms. And granted, for the sake of our conversation, you and I are talking in generalized terms. And so, of course, these things are not going to apply to everyone. And someone has to write the book in the chapter on cultural diversity. So can you sum up some of that listeners need to keep in mind as they consider mental health access for the African American community and really what mental health even means within that community?
So I think it's important for people to understand that the African American community continues to be the most religious group in America. And the most segregated time in America is 10 o'clock on a Sunday. So African Americans tend to go to church with other African Americans. But oftentimes in the African American church, the ideal has been taught that you don't have mental health issues, that any issue you have, God can solve. So you should just really pray about it and talk with your pastor, who may not even be trained in mental health, counseling. But you should just have conversations with them and just pray without ceasing. And maybe you should fast, and God will direct your steps. But reality is that people need to gain access. They need to know. I mean, we know in the African American community there is a stigma associated with mental health illness. We know, PTSD is very real in our community due to a variety, that generational trauma, as well as a lot of other things that we see taking place in our society. But we know that, there's a stigma within the African American community. And that's something that we within the community have to address. But I think that counselors being culturally competent and recognizing that, we do kind of focus or function more as a collective versus that individuality, and how important the church is to most African Americans. And I think that would be just very helpful in understanding how to begin that conversation with your African American patients.
Before you and I started recording, you were talking about some of the norms in the culture, and you brought up the idea of judges not understanding certain expenses. Um, as I interview you, for our listeners who know this, I'm white and immersed in white culture, and that was what I was born into. For people that are outside of African American culture, what are some of those norms? Like you already brought some up about thinking about hair care, things like this that are part of the African American identity that white Americans may not even realize that are part of, and actually are all part of self-esteem, of mental health, of basic self-care. Can you spend a moment talking about that?
So hair is a major issue. So, right. So your state, right, is the first one to outlaw discrimination based on natural hair. Reality is that there are some additional expenses if African American women decide to wear weave, whether it be braids or sew-ins or wigs or whatever. That's an expense. That our hair is different. It's very thick, so we do not wash our hair every day. That is not something due to lack of hygiene, but it would just dry it out and make it basically fall out. So recognizing those additional expenses when it comes to hair care, because it is extremely expensive if you get it braided or if you get weave put in. Recognizing that there are some differences in regards to. I've also, know that a lot of African American women, when I think of body shape, may not want to work out. And we see a lot of obesity in our community due to concerns of their hair. And what am I going to do with my hair because I don't have it braided and it's natural and I have to go to work? So swimming and working out, you may have quite a few, I mean, African Americans, there are a lot that do not know how to swim. And that is something that I was amazed to find out myself. I'm prior military, so I'm Navy. We had to be able to swim. But just recognizing some of those cultural differences and respecting them for exactly what they are. And then even verbiage. I recall speaking with the doctor who had interned in the urban core, and I was living in the suburbs, and she told me she had a patient who had come in and spoke about how she had almost fallen out. And my doctor said I had to ask her 3 or 4 times because I didn't know what that meant. Like she almost fell out. Well, what she was saying was that she was going to faint, that she had almost fainted. So even just terminology and understanding, and if you don't understand something, ask for clarification. People don't have a problem explaining it. But I think when we make assumptions, that's where we get into those problems. Just ask people if you don't understand something, if someone's speaking too fast, if they have a what you perceive to be a southern dialect or whatever, just ask them to slow down. Can you repeat that? I don't understand what that means.
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, I would like you to speak more about this, but this idea over the years in the mental health community that, as you said, things that are norms within a family or a norm within a certain ethnic or racial group having been pathologized because they're not the default font, if you will. And what you're bringing up about hair, about hygiene, all these concepts to me contribute to that. Habit within the mental health field of overdiagnosing certain issues in the African American community that we, if you took the same factors and had a white client, they wouldn't be diagnosed the same way. Can you speak to that of like what's happened in the way that the mental health community, so psychiatrists, therapists, anyone has kind of foxholed, if you will, African American individuals with these presuppositions of here's whatever the collective we look like in an ethnocentric European norm, and how we've applied that and have caused damage to the community.
So yeah, so there's in sociology we have two terms. So there's a term called ethnocentrism, which is viewing other cultures through the lens of your own. And that is what has happened in America. When we see Native Americans, our indigenous population, our Hispanic brothers and sisters, African Americans, again, white is the default race against which all others are compared. That's problematic. When you deal with your clients, you really need to recognize what ethnocentrism is, and you don't want to practice that. What ethnocentrism is, again, is judging and making assumptions or looking at other cultures through your cultural lens. And if you're part of the majority, which is that Eurocentric group, that's how you're looking at others. And reality is that we all have biases. And we tend to have, we tend to have bias towards those in the in group that's positive, but negative bias towards those in the out group. So what you want to practice instead of that ethnocentrism is cultural relativism, which is recognizing and respecting other cultures and looking at it through the lens of that culture. So just because one culture does something differently than your culture does not mean that it's incorrect. It's just the way that they do things. We had an opportunity. We lived in Europe for almost 6 years, and we lived in Germany. And in Germany, there's no such thing as personal space. Well, in America, is everybody, I mean, pre-COVID, right? Everybody had like this little bubble. They wanted, like, this is my personal space. Well, in Germany, there is no personal space, and so people, when they speak with you, they'll be right in front of you and they're speaking. They don't mean any disrespect. But again, if I'm using ethnocentrism, I would be looking at them from an American perspective, like, why are you like right in my face speaking? Where if I were, using cultural relativism, I would recognize that this is German culture. And they're not being disrespectful. And I need to look at it from their cultural lens.
I think that's a great example. And having lived in Italy, I experienced exactly the same. But I appreciate the simplicity of that example and the importance for us as mental health professionals learning more about another culture's lens so that we can be aware of ours and what is appropriate, if you will. I mean, and it's appropriate is obviously relative, particularly when you're not part of that group, but being more mindful of how that lens is affecting our diagnosing, our treatment planning, our clinical judgment. So to go into this topic of mental health access, what are the problems with our society that have prevented utilization of mental health access within that community?
Well, I think that we have to recognize that in the medical field, we've seen a lot of disparities, and I think that is kind of carried over even into mental health and just these systems. So we know, of Tuskegee eugenics, the father of gynecology, practice on slaves without anesthesia, and its reality is that there's a bias within a lot of fields when it comes to African Americans. And so oftentimes African Americans, just generally speaking, may be suspect, of interacting with the therapist. They may not want to be labeled. They may be afraid that they're not going to get the assistance that they need. Reality is because of institutional issues and continued discriminatory policies and practices that they may not work a full-time job. They may work somewhere 34 hours a week or two part-time jobs that offer them no insurance benefit. And too often, mental health care as well as medical care is accessed through our insurance agents. So not having access, that could be part of it, as well as that sliding scale. Are you taking into consideration people's income? And that, if you do that, that will allow them access. I mean, I remember being a student and not having much money and having to see a doctor, but they did it based on a sliding scale of what my income was. So that gave me access. But also recognizing that sometimes, representation is important. So when a person of color, an African American female, may want to speak to an African American female mental health practitioner who can assist her, because they'll understand some of those nuances within the culture. And they probably would be much more straightforward, with that clinician, because they feel that connection and that similarity, and they won't feel that they're being judged for any mental health issues that they may have. And we also need to recognize again how prevalent and impactful the church is in the African American community. So I've been to some churches where they kind of, preach from the pulpit, about, we'll just pray about it. But reality is mental health care is something that people should have access to. And they should be able to, afford that access and be provided that assistance. But again, oftentimes they want that representation so they can kind of just share everything without fear of being judged.
Right. And having looked at the statistics relatively recently, diversity in the field of psychotherapy is improving. But I know I had the experience just a few weeks ago looking for a clinician of color that had a specialization in a certain field and wasn't able to find it in my area, because that person literally didn't exist. And granted, where I live, there are absolutely diversity issues. And so I'm outside of Los Angeles, and this particular pocket where this person was seeking a referral is known for being very white. But it absolutely brought up this idea of, well, then where do you go to find services? You're going to have to drive further in order to find somebody that feels comfortable for you because they understand these aspects of your cultural and ethnic identity. When you think of, we'll just say, your average white clinician that is wanting to improve their, quote unquote, competence, with the idea that we never actually hit competence because everybody is different and we continue growing, what would you like the average white therapist to keep in mind when, gosh, even outreach efforts, interaction with the African American community, um, initial contact, what would that look like that's different than what you see?
So, one of the things I always recommend, they have the Harvard created the implicit association test. And I'm just a big advocate of that test. And it's based on speed and it really conjures up that unconscious bias that we have. And I would recommend that people take that because I think you can't mitigate something until you know that you have it. And as humans, we all have bias. And recognizing we have the in group and the out group. And if you're European or white, therapist and you're interacting with communities of color, it's imperative that you understand and you respect those cultural differences. They're not deficits or deficiencies, they're just different. So I would really hope that they would, seek to gain more knowledge, that they would take maybe some classes, some workshops on being culturally competent, understanding the institutional components that have continued to delay access or impede access to certain groups, understand why the communities function in the way that they do. So I'll give you an example. So initially, when the housing projects were developed, they were developed for veterans, right, and their families as they returned from war. And it was just a temporary thing just until they could get on their feet. Well, that was when it was very Eurocentric, people who were living there. Once they opened it up to the African American community, the rules kind of changed. And then all of a sudden, it was still income based, but now you couldn't have a man if you received any type of aid. So aid to family with dependent children, you could not have a man in the household. So there have been things that have happened in our society that have very much impacted, the minority community. So we see now 7 out of 10 African American children born out of wedlock. Well, to me, this is something left over, from that. Well, you can't have a man in the house if you need any type of assistance, and recognizing that we do have a lot of people of all different ethnicities who are receiving assistance is not just an urban issue. It's out in the suburbs, it's in rural areas. But it seems to be the face of that tends to be people of color. So we've had policy changes that have really negatively impacted African American families. So I would just really hope that people would get some history lessons on institutional racism, learn, the diversity, equity, and inclusion, like the correct terminology. Just as if you're working with the LGBTQI community, you need to know the correct, pronouns and terminology, and just be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations with African Americans, your friends, your family, or whomever, to gain additional insight into things that you may not know that are relevant and relative to what you are attempting to do.
I appreciate that. In a prior interview, one of the interviewees had suggested even just this idea of immersing yourself in different music and different TV shows and different movies, and understanding that these are representations that are outside of whatever lens community we've each grown up in, and the importance of that kind of exposure to even begin to understand. I believe it was Lambers Fisher that had said that, but this idea of looking at the pop culture stuff as also being a relevant and important reference point for particularly white clinicians, or for clinicians who are not part of any particular of a specific group, to try to understand a little bit more. So I had the experience when I was what I call a baby therapist. One of my first jobs was working in Los Angeles at a large rehab facility. And here I am, a petite white female therapist. At the time, was much younger than I am now, and was kind of bebopping down the hallways and working sometimes with clients that had some similar backgrounds, but more often than not working with clients from all different racial and ethnic backgrounds that were much different than my own. And my own awareness of, like, basically sitting there in a room with somebody where it's like, you have this lived experience that's profoundly different than I do. And just the immediate, sometimes with certain clients, this immediate, I don't know about you. It's like the best way, like eyebrow raised, I don't know about you. Um, that has to be part of this equation. This idea of how are clinicians making just a initial phone call seem accessible, or that intake. What are some of the factors from a cultural perspective that clinicians need to keep in mind to help establish trust with this community?
So you're going to have to build some social capital. I mean, ideally, I tell you, one of the best things is if someone else vouches for you, someone within the community, if they vouch for you and say, hey, this person is culturally competent. This is who I'm seeing. I'm having a good experience. Like, that spreads like wildfire. People will share that, but it's the same, right? If they've had a bad experience, they're going to tell the same story. So I think that, recognizing that your experiences are different, but, like you said, I like that idea of becoming immersed in different cultures and understanding, that, what we see, right, is the dominant culture. We see that displayed on television. I mean, that's what we see everywhere, and we see little pockets of diversity, in programming and things of that nature. But I think it's imperative for counselors to understand that you need to meet us where we are, and understand that sometimes we, at the African American, rightfully so, the community is suspect. And it's due to historical things, it's due to things that they've been told, and things that they've witnessed or they've experienced themselves. And so, during that initial intake, I would really work hard to try to build that rapport, and let my client know that, really this is about assisting you, and I'm willing to learn, to do what I need to do in order to assist you with whatever issues that you're having. That I'm only here, again, to assist you. I have no ulterior motive. This isn't, Tuskegee or eugenics or, anything of that nature. And just trying to build that rapport, because if you can develop that, if you can't get a sponsor, like that social capital, someone else within the community who can say, oh yeah, you're a good person, Beth is who I see, I'm quite happy with her, she's culturally competent, then you need to make sure at that initial meeting, that intake, that you're showing your competency, that you're working hard with us. Oftentimes it's about relationship building, and you have to develop that relationship and understand that, from the bottom, we're starting from the bottom and we have to go from there. So when we do the intake, so what would you like me to call you? Do you have a preferred name? How many children do you have? I mean, just general conversation to try to actually get to know that person. And then on that second meeting, I'd be like, so how's your son Levi doing? I mean, things like that, because that does develop that rapport, and that makes them feel special, like you remember and you understand and you want to connect with them on a deeper level.
I think the point you just made about the social capital is a really valuable one. And coming at mental health care from a medical model, which is not inherently a bad thing. We work in a managed care environment. Many people do, and we live in a managed care world for people who have insurance and have access to whether it's public mental health and medical care or privatized, whatever it is. One of the things that stand out to me is while you're talking about that, the difference between a psychological assessment, quote unquote, and kind of a meet and greet session and that complexity. For our listeners, there's a really good book by Dr. Daryl Chow called The First Kiss that talks about the importance of marrying those two concepts, and particularly for a population that has been incredibly I guess what I would say is abused and manipulated by the medical environment. And then again, coming into the mental health community where you have African Americans that have been overdiagnosed with very severe diagnoses like schizophrenia, that if we come out of the gate talking about symptomatology instead of what you just said, of like, how is your son Levi, that we're going to maybe check a box for our clinical documentation, which anybody listening knows I love my clinical documentation, given that that's my specialization, but that fundamentally more important than that is rapport building and actually creating a safe environment for someone to trust us and to begin helping them heal. So thank you for making that particular point. One of the pieces that you mentioned was even sometimes distrust that's kind of part of the church community. Do you feel like that's one of the issues that clinicians aren't necessarily um, at the front of outreach with the religious community to help establish trust?
Yeah, I think that would, to me, that would be a way to get a sponsor, right? If you were embedded, within the community and you gained a rapport with some of the African American pastors, I think that would be a definite end. They would provide you that sponsorship and that social capital that would allow the African American congregation that they have to develop that trust in you. So if my pastor says like, hey, I know Beth and she's good people. She only wants to offer, the best type of care. She's culturally competent. Guess who I'm going to choose to go to? And I mean, so I do think that's it. And I don't, and when I talk about the church, reality is that African Americans are very spiritual. I mean, if you think about it, and we talk about this quite a bit in sociology and even in psychology, if it were not for the church, oftentimes we don't know how our ancestors would have made it through slavery. Because that was like all they had was the afterlife was going to be a better place than the chains and the whips that they were experiencing in the current. And so, I mean, the reality is please don't ever discredit the African American church to a client, because it is a very important component of the African American community, and recognizing that spirituality, again, is very important. And also knowing that, oftentimes African Americans are not okay, like taking medicines. They, are very adverse to that when it comes to certain medicines because of that medical history we have in America. And then often it's just this ideal that there is a lack of trust, and I'm sorry that you all have to experience it, but it's legitimate. And I think we all have to respect and understand that it is a legitimate mistrust. It's something, I mean, it wasn't like it was 10 years or 20 years. I mean, it was hundreds of years. I mean, if you think about, medical issues we saw up until the 60s, discriminatory practices, even like you spoke about COVID. Who's being disproportionately impacted? The minority communities. Who's going to have lack of access to the vaccine? Again, the minority community. So recognizing that when you go into this, there probably is this distrust, and trying to break it down one ice, berg at a time. But so you have to create that. But I think medical, just that outreach within the community, getting to know some of the pastors. A lot of them belong to different organizations. Maybe going out to breakfast with them as a group and just, sharing what you have to offer, and what you're trying to do, you'll find that you'll get that sponsorship and that cultural capital.
I appreciate that you kind of gave some insight on how to do that. One of the things I also want to encourage to anybody listening to this, for today's podcast, Dr. Hodo and I are talking specifically about mental health and access. And we also have some other past episodes, some specifically that might interest you, like different treatment modalities that may be most effective with the African American community. Those are featuring Tia Briscoe, licensed marriage and family therapist. So please look for those in our course catalog. Because I know a lot of what Tammy just said. I'm going, oh yes, and then this, and then this, and I also want to take this interview in a different direction, but then remembering like, no, we're over here, and that there are all these different places that we can talk about. When it comes to that social capital, I'm reminded of something called feedback informed treatment, which is one of the things I'm really passionate about, and basically the research behind outcomes in therapy. And for anybody listening, when it comes to outcomes, when we're looking at a ethnic or racial difference between client and therapist, it's not actually irrecoverable, and the research has shown that. And that part of that is a lot of deliberateness by the practitioner to ask for feedback and to be open to guidance and insight from the client about their lived experience of a session or of an intervention, or just, are you listening well? Like, are you focused? And that all of those pieces contribute to the building of rapport. When you're talking about this, Tammy, one of the things that keeps coming up for me with when I'm thinking about anybody pursuing mental health care, automatic shame. Just, it's conditioned into us. If it's an addictive disorder, if it's depressed because we can't get out of bed, like whatever it is, nobody is like, oh, great. I have a mental health condition. I need help. Specifically in the African American community, how do you believe shame plays into the lack of pursuit of resources of mental health care, or prematurely dropping out of mental health care?
So I think it has a lot to do with it. I'm going to say something that's not culturally competent, but that I've heard in the African American community. Only white folks can have mental health issues. Only white people get depressed. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, that is so not true. But there's this ideal that we, African Americans cannot have these feelings. We cannot, and it's like, no, we can, because we're human. Or we don't have time for that. I don't have time for you to have mental health issues because I need you to go to work, or I need you to focus on this, or you need to do that. When reality is that mental health issue or illness needs to be diagnosed and treated in order for me to go on and do what I need to do and be successful. We see it all the time. If you think about shootings, one of the first things we see when it's white people, and we do, it's a mental health issue. But when we see, and it's an African American, they're a thug. If they're Muslim, they're terrorists. If they're Hispanic, so we all need to be cognizant of that and understand that that's part of the issue, is that the stigma is definitely there. And it's said in the African American community, no, we don't have these issues. We can't afford to have these issues. Those are white people's issues. And reality is no, those are all people's issues, but we need to remove that stigma from it within our own community and begin to address it. So I think it's imperative that people do seek assistance and that they let their guard down. But I think oftentimes African American community, we're so guarded because of so many, again, historical issues and contemporary things that we see. I'm in Jacksonville, Florida. Brunswick, Georgia's right up the street. Ahmaud Arbery, was out running one day, and he was shot and killed out running one day, by people who were not police officers, who decided that he looked like he did not belong in the neighborhood. So it's just a lot taking place, in the emotional toll of racism, in the systemic issues, mental health wise, and that trauma that continue to impact our communities must be addressed, but we within our community must be willing to get the assistance.
When it comes to reflecting on that trauma, working through that shame, regardless of what it's about, but this idea of mental health care, I'm just curious, this is based on your opinion as what you do, for the average African American person, how do they work through that? I mean, religious being a religious outlet being a primary part of it. I mean, but is it like, let me push it down? I grew up in an Irish Italian home, and certainly coming from a Catholic background as a child, it was like children should be seen and not heard, and we don't talk about that, and don't air your dirty laundry. So what are some of those norms of, like, basically what do we do with it, because we all have feelings? So I could tell you what happens in the Irish or Italian home on average, but what do you think happens in the African American psyche when we have that kind of stuff come up?
Is suck it up. Come on. We don't have time for that. And there's this whole thing about this strong black woman is killing us. And it literally it is killing us because we're not seeking assistance. No, you're a strong black woman. You should be able to handle anything. And it's like, no, it's okay to need help. But this whole idea, or that's a weakness, just like we see with men, if we think of it based on sex and gender norms, real men don't cry. I see that in the African American community, as if men can't have feelings, but the same again, but, just in general, that strong black woman, black women are super women and and it's killing us physically. And so we internalize all these issues, and then we get high blood pressure, diabetes, and all these medical ills from basically, trying to just suck it up, buttercup, and just address, not address it. I don't have time to have, this emotion because I have 10 things I need to do. Or I don't want to appear weak, because these aren't issues that we have in our community. We don't talk about, another thing is we don't talk about incest or child molestation, in the community. Oh, those are only things that white families deal with. That's not true. This is alive and well in the African American community too, but it's just not discussed. So I think that we need to definitely recognize that it's there. But again, they're told basically, you can have that feeling, but it's not going to be addressed. I'm going to need you to do X, Y, and Z, and just swallow that emotion and let's keep it moving. We don't have time for that.
When looking within the community, you had referenced previously, the challenges with law enforcement, but with judges. The thing that's also coming up for me is like the intersection, if you will, between counseling and social work, and that those are two very different things. And obviously, there's a lot of overlap between those. But from my own experience working, seeing the suspicion really when I introduce myself as a therapist, because it's like, well, are you a social worker? Are you part of Department of Child and Family Services? Am I going to be mandated to go to some class now? Tammy, you're nodding. Can you talk about that?
so the, and again, not culturally competent what I'm about to say. So there's a saying in the African American community: it's easy to get white folk in your business, it's extremely hard to get them out. So what that references is like the Department of Children and Family Service, law enforcement, the courts, things of that nature, any government, whether it be state, county, or federal institution. Oftentimes we do not want to be involved with, because there is this ideal that once you get them in, it's very difficult to get them out of your business. So like you mentioned, so am I going to be mandated to take classes? Are you going to take my kids away from me? These are some of the thoughts that go through our minds, when you tell me, well, you're, so are you a social worker? So who do you work for? Are you coming to remove my kids? Has someone reported me because I spanked them? Have they said something at school that was inappropriate? So all those things are exactly the reason that there's this mistrust, and oftentimes it's a misunderstanding of what a social worker does versus a therapist versus someone else. And so I think education is very important within our community too, so that we do and masses understand the differences. But I think that counselors, practitioners, and therapists need to be aware that there is this fear, because we've seen it too often. and that whole thought of it's easy to get. And what it really means is the system, to get the system into your business, but it's extremely hard to get them out.
I know Tia talks about working with African American clients and treatment planning in that other podcast episode that we have. But that idea that if we're coming at it again from a really medical model saying, well, here's what you need to do from an outside, as from someone who's outside the community, that could easily be construed as here's another person with their power telling me how I need to change what I'm doing. You're nodding. Tell me what you're thinking.
Yeah, because reality is that often we don't, it seems like people think we don't have agency, that we can't speak up for ourselves, and we can. And too often people will over talk us, they will tell us what they think they know more about us than we know about ourselves. And that's very dismissive and disrespectful. And that's the perception that people will take. So I think you have to be very clear as to why you want people to do certain things when you're talking to the African American community. So basically, you could say, well, Tammy, I believe that if you were to try to learn how to meditate, that may help you with some of your anxiety. And so meditation is this, and there are a variety of ways you could do it, and you could think of it in a spiritual form or however, but give examples and just why I need to do it, and that will help alleviate some of the stress that you feel. Or if you feel yourself being stressed out, maybe you want to go ahead and, remove yourself from that situation for 5 minutes, take several deep breaths, take a walk around the block, because then when you come back in, you've had an opportunity to kind of digest what has taken place, and you're ready to provide that feedback. But you have to kind of, and it's not rudimentary. It's not like we can't comprehend, but it's just understanding that we are suspect of certain things. And that whole power dynamic, when we look at, like Fortune 500 companies, what are there, 38 women that are in charge of them. Next month, we'll have one that'll be African American. That's the only third time, that we've had that. So it's very important to understand that power differential, and how that can be perceived, because we don't see a lot of people of color in positions of authority, and that representation matters.
Absolutely. Um, what are your do not do list items? I'm curious. Like speaking to counselors wanting to increase access and not only open the door, but keep the door open. And so create an environment that is safe and welcoming for clinicians that are listening and they're like, okay, what are things I absolutely should not do in working with this population? What are some of those things that come up for you just off the top of your head?
So don't make assumptions. That's very important. I think people need to realize, because too often we're viewed, and we talked about this before the call, before taping, is too often minority communities are, we're all kind of lumped together, so the African American community will be lumped together as this homogenous group without realizing, just like every other group, we have different social economic statuses, we have different educational levels, we have different political affiliation, religious ideologies, and beliefs. And so I think that's really important for therapists to know. Please don't group us all together, because you make those microaggressions, right? So I've had people say to me things like, well, I didn't know African Americans did that. Like, we do everything everyone else does. So don't make sure you're not committing those, microaggressions is another one. You're very articulate, or you're very professional, and things that you may think are a compliment are a microaggression to those in marginalized communities, right? I mean, as a woman, Beth, you understand because you experience them as well. Oh, wow, you own your own, so where's your husband in, at in this, these are not compliments, these are microaggressions. So be very cognitive, and aware of those microaggressions. I would also say that you need to check your privilege. So check your privilege. White privilege is very real. And oftentimes I'm still surprised how many African Americans have not necessarily interacted with a lot of European Americans. But if we look at the community school based model, we see kids now going to schools that are more segregated than their parents did. We see neighborhoods that are highly segregated. And so they may have not had a lot of interaction with a European American. So, consider that when you're interacting with them. Please don't mock the way that someone speaks. I've seen that too, like take on that form of speech that's very derogatory as well. If you don't understand something, ask. It's nothing. "Oh, I don't understand what that term means. Do you mind explaining it to me?" And that's fine. But again, just continue to really look at the person from a holistic perspective and don't make those assumptions. Make sure that you're not using, standing there or sitting there pontificating, right? Using our $500 words when we're not sure, right? Because that's a class issue. That's not a race issue. So not, when we're not sure, where our client falls in regards to class, whether they're going to understand what we're saying. And I would always ask for input, so, feedback. So what do you think about that? Did you want to add anything? What would you think about doing this? How can I assist you? Just things of that nature, I think are just very important. And to create that, you want to build a relationship is what you want to do. And the best way to do that is to have those conversations where they can let their guard down and recognize oftentimes that we do have our guards up. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard, when he talked about African Americans, back then we were called Negroes, but he talked about this two-ness, right? So you're African American and you're American. It's like these two souls are warring within your body, and it's taking all your strength not for those two not to tear you apart, and recognizing that intersectionality that we experience in American society, and that sometimes we're perceived as if we do not belong. And these are things we have to deal with on a daily basis. So that additional stress in itself, and when I come to you, I should be able to just and let it all go and just share exactly what is taking place in my life with no judgment.
I have so many comments, and I don't want to wrap up this interview because I want to keep going. Okay, let me gather myself. Tammy, you and I have talked about a lot of different ideas today, everything from consideration about diagnosis and assessment to social capital within the community to how to create a more welcoming environment that's actually supportive of whatever kind of recovery a client is seeking. This is your jam. This is what you do every day in trying to kind of bring awareness to this topic. How can our listeners get in touch with you? And also, what resources do you recommend to them? I know you do a lot of reading. What are your favorite books?
So, again, my company is All Things Diverse. You just type in Google All Things Diverse, and you'll see there that we have a way to contact. You just fill out the contact form, and someone will respond within 24 hours. I can also be reached at Tammy, which is TAMMY, at allthingsdiverse.com. We're all over social media, and again, our website is just allthingsdiverse.com. And I just really hope that everyone understands, that culture does play a role in counseling and that we all need to be culturally competent. Some of the good books that I would recommend is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And then I just had 2 chapters published in an African American Families book, Research, Theory, and Practice. And it's by Cognella is the academic publisher. And within the book, we have a variety of information. So, like, historical and contemporary influences on the African American family, the experiences of African Americans in urban environments, process adjustment and well being, about the African American family influences on child development and health, parenting within the community. Chapter 9 addresses parenting African American youth with mental health conditions. So the book was written, I think I was the only sociologist that contributed to the book, but it was written by those in uh, social work as well as psychology. So again, the book is African American Families, Research, Theory, and Practice. Another book would be White Fragility. I really highly recommend that. And then, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together is another book. If you're looking for documentaries, I would think like 13 is a really good one to watch. And I recommend my TED Talk, The Social Implications of Race, because I'll share I am biracial. I'm half European American, half African American, and I trace it from 1790, the census, until now, and just have a very in-depth conversation about race and how it continues to impact life chances and experiences and just how problematic that social construct is.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tammy. For everybody, again, this is Dr. Tammy Hodo. Thank you so much for joining us. You covered so many topics, so many points for continued learning, which I really appreciate. Thank you for spending this time with us.
Thank you, Beth. I enjoyed it.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.